friends, and welcome to the 31st broadcast of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Paul, and I'm afraid Ben had to be at his other job tonight. Now, if you think you've heard some weird stuff on this show before, you'd better buckle in for this one. We're headed for the Paranormal Fringe today. Now, most people think that the paranormal is just ghosts, UFOs, and maybe a Bigfoot here and there. But one of the reasons my own theories and methods are what they are is that all the other stuff taking place in the paranormal is weirder than weird, and I've run into it over the last 40 years. Now, the paranormal has to accommodate a lot more than just ghosts. Over the years, I've run into ghosts of people who are still alive, ghosts of animals, ghosts of buildings and whole towns. I've walked and talked with people who have experienced, I guess you could call them other lives, other times, other worlds, and creatures you couldn't make up if you tried. I've gathered stories of spontaneous human combustion and almost witnessed it myself. And that's only the beginning. But as Ben would say, first we have to do our weekly paranormal contest. Now, last week, Ann from Michigan was the first to answer last week's contest question. In parapsychology, what does DMILS stand for? And the answer, direct mental interaction with living systems. Had that on the tip of your tongue, right? This can be anything from communicating with animals the way our friend Karen Anderson does to having electrodes plastered to your head to see if your brain reacts to a plant in distress 3 rooms away. Direct mental interaction with living systems. Now, today's question is a tough one. If you were out alone on a dark road in Staffordshire, England, what paranormal animal might you meet? Now, we're looking for the actual local name, not the general name. If you want to tackle that one, drop a quick message or call us at 888-235-7374. If nobody gets it before the end of the show, drop a line to Ben at behindtheparanormal.com. Be the first to get it right and win a copy of, an autographed copy, I guess, of my 2006 book, Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny. And as we totter on the edge tonight, please feel free to join the discussion. Share your questions and your own stories with the rest of us. Drop a quick message or call us at 888-235-7374. Now, as I've said, it was these lesser-known phenomena and aspects of the paranormal that helped convince me many years ago that the traditional interpretation of the paranormal in general, and ghosts in particular, just isn't good enough. They helped convince me that we're dealing, I guess, not with some two-dimensional, human-centered spirit world, but with an infinity of complete, sometimes very alien, parallel worlds coexisting and interacting on multiple levels in multiple dimensions with our world, all the time. I will say that I have some personal connection with all the cases I'll mention today, usually by having talked to witnesses, researching the original documents, or by visiting the scene myself. So let's take the leap. Hold on. On October 1st, 2000, a pretty fringe article appeared in La Prensa, the Mexico City newspaper. It included a report from a commercial airline pilot telling about how he and his co-pilot had seen a little flying man, quote unquote, while they were descending to land at Benito Juarez International Airport in Mexico's capital city. Quote, and this is translated by my little bit rusty Spanish, but here we go. A commercial airline pilot from Iro, California, who wanted to omit his name to avoid problems at work, reported seeing a little flying man who was flying at the same altitude of the plane before landing. According to the pilot, this flying man had a kind of backpack on his back and was flying freely. The pilot added that he could see the man's arms and legs very well. Now, I must say that I did check up on certain things. What might come to mind is a jetpack. You sometimes see them at circuses or something, and the military never considered them very practical, but they do exist and people can fly. But they're very obvious. They don't fly really as high, certainly not as high as a commercial airplane or airliner, and there was no one, as far as anybody knew, using one at this time. The whole thing was pretty weird. Flying humanoids. That's what we call these things. It's an old phenomenon with reports dating back to the beginnings of human history. I mean, remember that angels are always pictured with wings, for example. But the phenomenon is getting some new attention lately, and that's Interesting that many reports of flying humanoids are coming from the area of course, Mexico City, all the way north through Arizona, that whole region. Over the past 20 years, Mexico City certainly has become one of the greatest UFO capitals of the world. Certainly a tremendous outbreak of UFO reports going on there, and have been for some time. And many of them have been recorded on videotape, and you can see a lot of them on YouTube. One of the weirdest of the flying humanoid reports from that region is from 2004, when 2 Mexican police officers were reportedly attacked by what they described as a, quote, flying witch, unquote. Oh, you poor, long-suffering Wiccans out there. Anyway, there's a picture of this creature on our Talking Points page for this show at BehindTheParanormal.com. And if you can connect with that without disconnecting from us, go to BehindTheParanormal.com and look for our Talking Points link. And there are that and several other pictures that go with our theme of the weirdest of the weird this evening. First one being this so-called flying witch, or one of them anyway. This police officer was quoted as saying, quote, "It was a woman all dressed in black that fell from a tree, but she didn't touch the ground, just remained floating several feet off the ground. Soon as I realized it was a kind of woman or witch, very strange, standing there trying to cover her face, she threw herself against my car very quickly, falling on the car and hitting the windshield." It kind of makes you think of the Blair Witch Project, with the so-called Blair Witch, floating off the ground and all this business. Anyway, this officer, whose name was Gerardo Garcia, a young fellow, passed every drug, alcohol, and psychological test his superiors could throw at him, and later, one or more of these, quote, flying witches was seen by hundreds of local people and members of the media. These flying humanoids, or ones like them, have been seen all over the world pretty much throughout history. Lots of them have surely been, balloons, kites, deliberate hoaxes, or natural phenomena. I know of one for sure that was a balloon, or a series of balloons put together deliberately to make people think it was one of these. Or it could even be people flying ultralight aircraft in remote areas. But plenty of them are unexplained, and plenty of them are really, really scary to look at, I have to say it. Weird humanoids in general can go way beyond Sasquatch and alleged flying witches. For example, in Hartford, Maryland, early on a Saturday morning in 2000, a man named Kessler reported being on a deserted highway and seeing a 7 or 8 foot tall creature step out of the median strip and into the path of his car. Kessler said the creature had dark hair, dark hair actually, a flat, featureless face, little black eyes, no nose, and a large row of pointed teeth. Now, up to this point, this could be a garden variety Bigfoot sighting, but listen to this. According to, Mr. Kessler, the creature was dressed in a brown work shirt, pants, and black boots. It turned its head, grinned at Kessler, and then disappeared right in front of him. The witness reported that he nearly skidded off the road after hitting his brakes, and we're not going to comment on the workforce in that part of Maryland. Anyway, apparently Kessler and several other people saw the same or a similar creature over the next few years. Now, if it weren't for the disappearing part, I'd go for the explanation as some kind of hoaxer in a gorilla suit. Now, I can imagine, of course, the booze or whatever could have been big factors here, and there was only a single witness. But we have to be open-minded enough to consider that these things don't necessarily mean that Kessler didn't see this creature. Now, especially because there are sightings like this from all over the world, sometimes reported by multiple witnesses. Now, the disappearance of this humanoid from plain sight brings us to our next topic, paranormal appearances and disappearances. And sometimes a case involves both. Let me just pause for a minute to remind you, you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on Achieve Radio, and we're talking this evening about the weirdest of the weird cases of paranormal, and we've talked about appearing and disappearing people and other things. And sometimes these cases are well-attested stories of human bilocation, people being at different places at the same time. And this is rather common among some stories of saints, mystics, and shamans from all parts of the world, sometimes involving all parts, I should say all sorts of different religions as well. It's not just Christianity or any of these religions. It could be any of them, any mystics or saints, as they say. Now, one famous case of that occurred in 1620, and even though it was way back there, it was pretty well attested and pretty well documented. That was when a young nun named Sister Mary of Agreda in Spain, embarrassed her superiors with her persistent tales of missionary flights, and she said flights, to the Humano Indians in Mexico. Sister Mary claimed that she regularly made this 2,000-mile trip in the air. Now, nobody was prepared to take her seriously, especially because nobody happened to notice that she was missing from the convent at Agreda, and she made the far-fetched claim that during her flights, she noticed that the earth was round. Of course, everybody knew that by this time, but it was interesting to hear her say that she was apparently at some sort of height, which gave her this this sort of insight. Now, I suppose, of course, the official missionary who was assigned to this tribe, the Humano, whose name was Father Benavides, complained directly to the Pope in 1622 that the Indians had already been taught about the Catholic faith by a mysterious, what he called a lady in blue, unquote, who had handed out rosaries, crucifixes, and even a chalice, which proved to be from the convent at Agreda. And I don't know if she was shoplifting chalices here or whatever, but it ended up somehow in Mexico. Now, on being closely questioned by Father Benavides, Sister Mary revealed a detailed knowledge about the Indians' way of life and language and described individual members of the tribe accurately, much to his amazement. Now, this sort of thing, there's a word for this, teleportation of people. I know that was one of our contest questions several weeks ago. But teleportation of people, this is generally how this is looked at in parapsychology. People being moved either, well, not always against their will, but in a paranormal fashion from one place to another. Like many teleporting people, that the story of Sister Mary, and I guess her missionary activities apparently, seems to defy any kind of analysis. Even today, people aren't sure what this really is. And there are lots of cases, and it's hard to deny that some of them at least aren't real. But it certainly makes sense, of course, from our multiverse perspective, implying that perhaps our travel between worlds can be controlled, even by our subconscious. That's a subject for a whole different show, I think. Now, the fact that Sister Mary saw that the earth was round indicates some kind of travel, of course, through the air, yet this chalice was solid enough. Of course, as you know, there were no airlines plying the skies between Mexico and Europe in the 1600s. The sudden appearance of solid objects, often in sealed rooms, is part of this phenomenon too, as well as just people. And this is sometimes called apportation, solid objects appearing and disappearing. The Soviets were experimenting with this sort of thing, and I have reason to believe the Pentagon is too. And airports can literally be anything, and from stones or musical instruments, dish of hot food, fresh flowers, or whatever out of season. But again, we look at it from the multiverse perspective. And now there are some more modern cases, of course, of weird appearances and disappearances as well. And I have a whole list in front of me from my files here, and I'll just pick a couple here. And again, some appearances, some disappearances. All right, here's one. In 1851, excuse me, a fellow was found wandering in a village near Frankfurt, Germany. And he couldn't explain how he'd gotten there. He said that he lived in Luxaria, in a country called Sacria. Neither place was known to exist now or then. And there are a number of examples. One from the Tokyo airport from the 1950s, when a man simply appeared with a passport, not from Sacria, but from some other country. He spoke no known language. He was wearing clothes of no known make. Even the labels on the clothing was, nobody knew what company it was, this sort of thing. And he died, from what I understand, he eventually ended up in a psychiatric hospital where he eventually died. And who were these poor, misplaced people? Now, again, you could say, sure, some of them are insane. You could fake this stuff, sure. But there are so many cases from so many places. One does wonder if they are not brought in or somehow teleported from some other parallel world, as we say. In 1975, a man in a neatly pressed pinstripe suit was found dead, apparently having fallen from a highway overpass near Oxford, England. And again, the manufacturer's labels had been removed from his clothes, and the body bore no identification. The man carried 5 handkerchiefs, each of which bore the initial M, and a thin strip of foil containing 15 tablets of a then new drug called Vivalan. This drug was so new that few doctors knew of its existence, and those who did it prescribed it only to women, none of whom knew who M was. And the identity of the man has remained a mystery to this day, and M, it seems, had stepped out of thin air, presumably at some point above the highway, and apparently plummeted to his death. Now, this has, you say, might have the CIA written all over it or something, and maybe it does, but again, these are very relatively common events. One day in September 1877, here's another case. Mr. W.H. Smith glanced at the sky over Brooklyn, New York. And here we are back to our flying humanoids. He had never before seen anything in the sky except clouds, birds, and snowflakes in the winter, and he probably didn't expect to see anything different today. But in fact, what he saw was a winged human form, quote unquote, and the sight so impressed and startled him that he wrote a letter to the New York Sun about it. Now we're moving all the way up to 1976, and a strange humanoid appearance that occurred in North Carolina. A little boy who was 8 years old named Tonley of Dunn, North Carolina, saw a little man, which he described not much bigger than a Coke bottle, unquote, who wore black boots, blue trousers, and a blue top with, quote, the prettiest little tie you ever saw, unquote. The boy insisted that he had seen the little man and became very upset when his story was not believed. But disconcertingly for adult doubters, Tonley was able to show where he had seen the mini-man, and a search revealed a clear trail of tiny footprints. Okay? Well, there we are. And again, we invite you to call in with any strange stories you might have. They have to be pretty weird, though, to fit with our show tonight. And I wanted to mention, of course, that you can call us naturally at 888-235-7374 or send us a quick message. There was a fellow who, in the latter part, actually the beginning of the 20th century, is a real hero to those who follow the paranormal and its many ins and outs, and his name was Charles Fort. He spent much of his life in the British Museum gathering stories of oddities and strange things and strange disappearances and things of this kind that sort of defied explanation and but were nevertheless printed in newspapers all over the world. And he gathered these into huge books. Today there are versions of his books that are well over 1,000 pages, and they just contain one case after another of weird things. They don't necessarily fit with our classical interpretations, but I think they kind of match up with the multiverse, in my opinion. Okay, I'm going to read a couple from his notes here and to see what we can see as far as these really weird cases are concerned. Here's a headline from the Chatham News from Kent County in England, dated January 10th, 1914. It says, "Naked in the street, strange conduct by a strange man." And apparently early in the evening of January 6th of that year, 1914, it says the weather was bitterly cold, and a naked man appeared from nowhere that could be found out, and he was on the main street of Chatham. The man ran up and down the street until a policeman caught him, and he could tell nothing about himself. Naturally, the doctors said he was insane, which, of course, they said with their customary appearance of really saying something. And this naked man appeared very suddenly. Nobody had seen him on his way to his appearing point. His clothes were searched for but could not be found. And nowhere near Chatham was anybody reported missing. These appearances of naked people sometimes are well documented as well, and sometimes it seems as if people are teleported, if it really is from some other part of the multiverse, some of their clothes don't necessarily go with them, which is very interesting because ghosts, which I believe are people seen across the boundaries of worlds, very often have clothes and sometimes cars and things you'd see in the world. So this is an interesting kind of a point here. Here's another account. This is from the London Times of January 30th, 1874, of repeated disappearances of young men in Paris. And apparently that there was a wave of those sorts of things. Here's one from the New York Sun, April 25th, 1885. And it was said that a fellow named Isaac Martin, a young farmer living near Salem, Virginia, had gone into a field. And this is familiar in a way. Gone into a field to work, and they had disappeared. and it said that in this region there had been other mysterious disappearances. Now, that harks back to our paranormal question from 2 weeks ago. Who was the guy reported to have crossed a field in Tennessee in 1880, I believe, and disappeared in plain sight in front of all these people? Well, that answer was David Lang, but the David Lang story apparently was not, it was something that never even really occurred, and there was some controversy about that, but apparently it's true that a bored journalist in the town of Gallatin, Tennessee, had written this up, and there was the blame went to Ambrose Bierce, the great author of fiction, among other things, and journalist, who had written a story called The Difficulty of Crossing a Field. And there were a number of cases, or stories at least reported, in which people crossed fields and disappeared, never to be seen again. And whoever did this David Lang thing, and this one seems like something like that, but it's, again, New York Sun, April 25th. It was in the newspaper, so take it or leave it. Here's another one. In Montreal, in July and August of that year, 1892, there were so many unaccountable disappearances in that Canadian city that in the newspapers, the headline, "Another Missing Man," became common. In July of 1883, there was a similar series. Montreal, the London Evening Star, of November 1926, November 2nd, 1926, quote, "Mysterious series of disappearances, 8 persons missing in a few days." And this goes on and on and on. I have records of 6 people who between January 14th, 1920 and December 9th, 1923 were found wandering in or near the small town of Romford in the county of Essex, England, unable to tell how they got there or anything else about themselves. I have many cases like that of a man who told that he was walking along Euston Road in London, and his next memory, 9 months later, came to him when he found himself working on a farm in Australia. Now, again, amnesia, whatever, there may be medical conditions about this, but it is pretty strange. All right. So certainly among the weirdest of the weird are the stories told by the people who actually survive these space-time slips. Now, I happened to catch up with a couple of these people in 1982 when I was in England, and if I can find my notes here, I can tell you more about it. That is, there were a foursome of people who had taken a vacation together, and they had been driving through parts of continental Europe, and this occurred in 1979, and I was able to talk to them in 1988, 9 years later when I was in England. Their names were Len and Cynthia Gisby, and their friends, Jeff and Pauline Simpson, were taking a vacation with them. And this foursome was driving, as I say, through France en route to their vacation in Spain. And they decided, as they told me the story, they decided to find a hotel. They'd driven quite a ways and were tired. And they stopped at a motel on the main Montélimar Nord autoroute. L'autoroute, I should say, with the proper French, is like a superhighway or an interstate in America or a motorway in Britain. But anyway, this motel was fully booked, and they were told to keep going. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening when the couples eventually found an older hotel set in a very nice tree-lined lane just off the main road. They pulled opposite the building and parked. And they had driven, as I say, several hundred miles and were really tired. They were impressed by the old world atmosphere in this place, heavy wooden doors and all this sort of thing. People seemed to be dressed in older clothes. And the landlord was a jovial chap who welcomed them, and he had no trouble understanding English. But you had to understand more than English to just even grasp what was going to happen to these people. So we'll come back to this story after we are finished with our break. And I remind you again, you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on Achieve Radio. And we're talking about the weirdest of the weird aspects of the paranormal and cases you will not believe. Stay with us.
is Sherilyn, and you're listening to AchieveRadio.com.
Hi folks, this is Paul Eno, co-host of Behind the Paranormal here on Achieve Radio. We're very pleased to have as our sponsor New River Press and Barking Cat Books, publishers of some of the most unusual New Age titles on the market today. Along with 4 books by moi, New River Press offers the blockbuster on animal communication, Hear All Creatures, The Journey of an Animal Communicator by Karen Anderson, Shadows on My Shift, real-life stories of a psychic EMT by psychic medium Sherry Lee Devereaux, Achieve Radio talk show host of Opening Your Intuitive Eyes, and in a true story that will break your heart with its beauty, especially if you've ever lost a child, there's 41 Signs of Hope by Dave Kane, about the ongoing love and communication between a father and a mother and their son, youngest victim of the 2003 nightclub fire in Rhode Island. Finally, from Barking Cat Books, don't miss the action-adventure that spans 1,000 years, Heaven's Wave, a novel of the doomsday prophecy of 2012 by Dierline. Visit newriverpress.com, barkingcatbooks.com, amazon.com, or your favorite bookstore.
There is something inside us that aches to change the world, that wants to make a difference. But sometimes we get stopped because we think, well, how can I make a difference? What can one person do? Well, imagine if everyone who felt that way got together. How powerful would that be? Well, that's exactly what Humanity Unites Brilliance does. It brings together people who feel the same way about global transformation and provides a central uniting place for everyone to get together to move towards creation of a world of self-sustainability and self-empowerment. Go to passionforhumanity.com and see what I'm talking about. Here's a chance to unite some of the most effective nonprofit and for-benefit organizations and at the same time give you access to resources from some of the world's most inspirational leaders. You'll meet people with similar visions as you. You'll have a support network designed to connect you and your passions with others. You'll transform while you help transform the world. PassionForHumanity.com. Explore and change the world.
New River Press is proud to sponsor tonight's segment of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Benjamin Eno. New River Press offers the best in unusual New Age books. Stand by the side of tonight's host, Paul Eno, as he battles poltergeists and helps suffering souls and families in the critically acclaimed books Faces at the Window and Footsteps in the Attic. Plunge deeper into the paranormal with Paul and learn about his influence on human history, its action in our daily lives, and its ultimate meaning for us in the best-selling Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny. Available now from New River Press, publishers of unusual books. Visit newriverpress.com, amazon.com, or your favorite bookstore. And set for release late this year in one of the most unusual books on the subject ever written, Paul gives us Dancing Past the Graveyard, What Ghosts Have to Say About God.
You're listening to AchieveRadio.com, the positive side of broadcasting.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on Achieve Radio. We are talking about cases from the weirdest fringes of my own paranormal files, and we'll continue in a second. But let me first repeat our paranormal question of the week. If you were out alone on a dark road in Staffordshire, England, what paranormal animal might you meet? Now, we're looking for the actual local name, not the general name. And if you want to give it a shot, drop a quick message or call us at 888-235-7374. If nobody gets it before the end of the show, drop a line to Ben at behindtheparanormal.com. Be the first to get it right and win an autographed copy of my 2006 book, Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny. In the meantime, feel free to join in and share your weird stories with us about the ultra-weird. Drop us a quick message, or again, the number, 888-235-7374, toll-free in the U.S. and Canada. And we were talking about our poor hapless foursome, 2 couples traveling in Europe in 1979, and encountering a very, very interesting old hotel on a side lane in France. And as I said, the landlord understood English. They booked 2 rooms, and they settled down to a meal of steak, eggs, and fries served on old-fashioned plates. There were tankards of beer and satisfied with the meal, the couples decided to retire for the night. There were some surprises in store for them, I must say, when they investigated their bedrooms. They told me this is Mr. Gisby actually told me they were struck by how old-fashioned the beds were and the rooms themselves. And he said the beds were very high with bolsters instead of pillows, and there were thick sheets and several blankets. And the windows didn't have any glass in them, just wooden shutters. The doors didn't have any locks, just wooden latches. We weren't all that bothered because everything was very comfortable, and being in rural France, we just thought that was the way that they lived there. They shared a bathroom between their two rooms. It was also kind of unusual. There was an old-fashioned tub on legs, and there was an equally ancient-looking shower attached to the wall and covered by a grill. Even the soap, instead of the usual loose bars of soap we have today, was attached to the bath by an iron rod. Now, they got up at about 7 the next morning and had a good night's sleep, and they went down to a typical continental breakfast, coffee, bread, and jam, and all that. Now, just as they were finishing their meal, a young woman came in, followed by two French police officers, right? Len was struck by the men's uniforms. He said they both wore gaiters, high hats, and capes. Uniforms quite unlike the ones that they had seen the gendarme, the French police, wearing the day before as in their travels. And Len told me, he said, the young woman was dressed up strangely, too, in a long chiffon dress and button-up boots. The time I remember my granny used to wear, he said. And Len asked the cops for directions to the road or actually the highway for Avignon. And he said that the French policeman seemed puzzled at the word l'autoroute, okay, meaning highway or motorway. But they gave directions for Avignon, Len said, and he later said that there was the original road to Avignon from there, which had been built in the Middle Ages. Once breakfast was over, Len sought out the landlord to pay the bill, and almost fell over when he found out that it was only going to be 19 francs. That's because this was before the days of the euro, but 19 francs, which would be about $2.50 today. He said he thought there had to be a mistake. And he goes, usually you figure on paying, 200 to 250 francs at the time for a hotel room and food, excuse me, especially for 4 people. But the guy insisted that the bill was right, and Len said that he paid up. Now, before setting out for Spain, Len and Jeff took photographs of their wives standing by the shutters in their respective rooms. Now, when they eventually got going, they found that there was a highway to Avignon, though the cops hadn't seemed to have been aware of it, and the directions had referred only to that original road, as I said. Now, you don't pass up a chance to spend a cheap night in a comfortable hotel like that with good food, so when they returned from Spain by car, the Gisbys and the Simpsons turned off the Montélimar Nord autoroute again, and once again found the tree-lined lane that they had remembered from the hotel the previous time they'd stayed there. But the place had vanished. Thinking they must have missed it, they turned around and drove back, and 3 times they drove up and down the road, but the hotel was nowhere to be seen. Even the place where they had parked the car was missing. And Len said, I'm certain as can be that we were on the right road. We went to the same turnoff, past the same motel where we had originally asked for accommodation and where we'd been advised to try down the road. We passed the same building on that road we passed before, with the same advertising sign on it and the same roadworks signs. We couldn't have been on a different road. That was the main road between Avignon and Lyon, apart from the autoroute. According to Len, everything about the place was the same except for the hotel not being there. Now, the 4 of these people were forced to continue to Lyon, where they stayed at a hotel that charged them 247 francs for bed and breakfast, evening meal, and drinks. Now, puzzling again over the strange events, the couples returned to England, and 2 weeks later, when the photographs from their trip were developed, the mystery even got deeper. For on both rolls of film that Jeff and Len had taken, every photograph had come out with the exception of the ones taken at the Mystery Hotel. There were not even any spoiled negatives on the roll of film. It was as if the photographs had never been taken. Now, later, talking over these weird occurrences with a French friend, Len and Cynthia were surprised to learn that the three people they had seen that morning in the hotel must have been wearing clothes. This person, the friend of theirs, was a dressmaker and knew clothes pretty well. And they said that these three people, the two policemen and the young woman, were wearing clothes that dated back to the early 1900s. Now, according to the friend, the style of the police uniforms had certainly not been worn since about 1905. Now, of all the explanations that the Gisbys and Simpsons have ever been given, for Len and Cynthia, at least only one seems to ring true, and I like to think that I gave it to them when I explained the multiverse theory that I was pretty sure of by 1989 when I saw them. They were both sympathetic to the idea, and they believed that they experienced a multiverse time slip. The phenomenon then involves a person, of course, moving backwards or forwards in time, actually moving between different worlds where it is different times, and having not only done that, but having stayed there, rather cheaply one might add, for over 24 hours, eating, drinking, talking to people, quite a remarkable situation. There are a number of cases like that. One in particular in Scotland that I know about where people were actually simply taking a walk while on vacation, and they walked over a hill to a village that apparently they found the next day never existed. Okay, and quite a few things like this happen, but we don't hear about them very often because, you know, how do you talk about things like this? How do you classify them if all you believe in is the spirit world? You know, how do you talk about these things? Well, there's a case of my own that I recount in Footsteps in the Attic, my 2002 book, I should say, which occurred in Vermont, and it was quite a situation that in its own right. Now, it was summer of 1975, and I was visiting friends in rural Vermont that July, not far from the village of Enosburg Falls. Now, ironically, that's up in the north, not far from the Quebec border. And ironically, the place is named after my great-great-great-great-grand-uncle Roger Eno, a Revolutionary War general who was once accused of treason by, of all people, Benedict Arnold. That's a whole different story, obviously. Anyway, one clear evening, we were lounging about on the porch, my friend's porch there, and we listening to the crickets and a couple of whippoorwills and a couple of having a nice, quiet conversation. All of a sudden, a red pickup truck bounced down the road in a cloud of dust, and the people in it turned out to be Clement Ridley and Bud Harper, two surveyors from down country, as the Vermonters call it, who had driven up to meet me. And after some talk about my recent cases, especially this Bridgeport poltergeist thing that had occurred very, very shortly before that, only the previous November, we got down to business about something that had happened to them. And my friend said, when are you going to tell Paul about what happened to you? And Ridley said, well, he'll think we're crazy or drunk. I mean, he was on his second beer. I've heard everything at least twice, I reassured him, and in fact, I'd never heard anything quite like what he was about to tell me at that point. I was still kind of early in my career. It was still the 1970s. The previous summer, it seems, Ridley and Harper were getting ready to survey boundaries for a farmer in the town of Johnson, Vermont, about 20 miles south of where we were sitting on this particular night. And from my notes here, I have, quote, I was walking the bounds with my partner, and we had the U.S. Geological Survey map of the area. We'd just come out of the woods into a field, and were walking a little downhill. It was early afternoon, and we sat down on the ground to look at the map and think about the survey we were going to begin. That's Ridley talking. And, you know, it says these USGS survey maps all have the main buildings and houses on them, right on the maps, and that were there at least when they made the map. And now there is a good-sized farmhouse just across this field, about a quarter mile away, where there was an old dirt road that marked the property, and the house wasn't on the map, he said. And they both kind of shook their heads and, you know, smirked at each other over the inefficiency of the government, something we all like to do. And the two men completed their walk down this road, and it was kind of rutted and little used, and there wasn't any sign that anybody had used the road recently. And the way Harper told it, we were in the road about 60 feet from the house, and it was pretty dilapidated, old and surrounded by a stone wall. The house didn't look as if it had ever been painted, but you could tell somebody lived there. There was smoke coming out of the chimney, even though it was a warm day, and there were clothes on the clothesline. And this is when they said they saw the man. And he came around a corner of the house with an axe over his shoulder, and Ridley described him as a slim guy with a broad-brimmed hat and a big beard. Couldn't really tell how old he was. The two men noted that the whole scene was just strange. There were no cars or trucks in the yard, and there were no electrical wires overhead or any other signs of modern life. And Harper said, I was curious where this guy's property lines were, so I called to him. He didn't seem to hear me, just kept going toward the front, and then stooped to look at something on the ground. Ridley shouted to the man, then started to walk toward the stone wall. The guy just, quote, this is a quote, the guy just stood up and looked around kind of confused, but he still didn't seem to see us. It was really weird. We figured the guy might be a little deaf, but he must have been blind too. The two surveyors started to feel very uncomfortable. And one of them said, there are still some pretty strange people in these hills, and the guy had an axe. So we figured that retreat was the best thing to do. A couple of days later, the surveying job actually began. And Ridley said, when we got back to that field and that road, we were shocked to see that the damn house wasn't even there. There was no sign of it. We didn't make a mistake about where we were. Maps don't lie. Now, Ridley later on was at he was a little bit shaken up here, to say the least. He was at the town hall a few days after that. That's a hangout for surveyors and other people who get involved in documents. He was still pretty flummoxed and even upset, and he made a few inquiries. According to the town records, there had been an old house on that road, but it had burned down in 1910. The day after our conversation on the porch, Ridley and Harper invited me to come with them to the site. As I say, it was about 20 miles from where I was. Several turns off the main road, and we came to a little lane that kind of meandered toward the nearby mountains. It was very rutted and muddy, as they had described it, and we had to plow along with the four-wheel drive on in their truck. Ridley pointed out the spot, and we left the truck and went over to look at it. They were kind of quiet. They didn't even want to approach the spot, as I recall. As we got out of the truck and approached, and I could see where the remains of a stone wall had been and an almost vanished foundation. They were real spooked. I noticed the plants, creeping phlox and dwarf conifers, which love rocky ground and are common at abandoned home sites in New England. They were abundant there. I kind of kicked around the place but didn't find anything unusual. I did notice that a few of the old foundation stones were blackened as if there had been, indeed, a fire. And we left just as mystified as we had come. I had no reason to doubt the two men who had told me the story. They were both professional gentlemen. But I did doubt that I had ever even begun to fathom the true depths of the paranormal. And again, this is one of the cases that really got me going on the idea that we're dealing with far more than just a spirit world and spirits of the dead and all this stuff. And that the paranormal is, as we see it, is sometimes just the tip of the iceberg. And that brings us to a phenomenon that's not only ultra weird, it's ultra scary. Spontaneous human combustion. People bursting into flames from the inside and being almost completely consumed. Spontaneous human combustion has been known throughout human history, and the great English novelist Charles Dickens was fascinated with it, and he was so fascinated that he used to collect examples of it, and he used it as part of the plot in Bleak House, his novel, which has been made into several films and plays since then. He wrote pretty much a lot in the 1840s and 50s. Okay, now let's look at what human combustion really is supposed to be here. All right. Let's look at some examples. And again, it seems to be people just bursting into flames from the inside. One of the examples that I have here in my files is the death of the 62-year-old Countess Cornelia Bondi near Verona, Italy. And that's got to be one of the more reliable reports from that period, certainly in the mid-1800s. And according to an official statement, I'm sorry, this is 1731 this case occurred. But there was an official statement, a document still exists, dated April 4th of that year, when the Countess had been put to bed. She was not a well woman. Of course, she was, at 62 at that period was pretty old, I guess. And she had been put to bed and fell asleep after several hours' conversation with her maid. Now, in the morning, the maid returned to wake her and found a very upsetting scene. The document said the floor of the chamber was thick smeared with a gluish moisture not easily got off. And from the lower part of the window trickled down a greasy, loathsome, yellowish, the word is liquor, with an unusual stink. Sounds like something right out of an H.P. Lovecraft story. Specks of soot hung in the air and covered all the surfaces of the room, and the smell had penetrated adjoining rooms. The bed itself was undamaged. That's interesting. That very often is the case in these situations. The surrounding articles just seem to survive very well. The sheets were turned back, indicating that the Countess had gotten out of bed at some point. And this is a quote from the document. 4 feet from the bed was a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched, stockings on, between which lay the head, half of the back part of the skull, and the whole chin burned to ashes, among which were found 3 fingers blackened. All the rest was ashes, which had this quality, that they left in the hand a greasy and stinking moisture. All right. Here's another case. This is the case of Dr. J. Irving Bentley of Coudersport, Pennsylvania. He was 93 years old and naturally a retired physician. There was a gas company worker, Don Gosnell, and he discovered the remains of Dr. Bentley after smelling a light blue smoke of unusual odor, quote unquote. The fire had been so intense that it almost totally consumed the old man. The deputy coroner said, quote, all I found was a knee joint atop a post in the basement, the lower leg from the knee down, and the now scattered ashes 6 feet below, unquote. And yet the fire had mysteriously been contained. Firemen testified to the existence of a few embers around the hole and a slight scorching on the bathtub about a foot away, but the rest of the area was pretty much untouched, and certainly the temperature at which this thing would have had to been to consume this body would have been tremendous, and yet the area was pretty much untouched, and the house certainly showed no signs of having caught fire itself. The burns were on the bathtub, and they were still visible 9 years later. Okay. Now, strangely enough, I believe that several of my own cases over the years have taken me close to witnessing spontaneous human combustion. The first was in 1974, when I was working with Ed and Lorraine Warren on that infamous Bridgeport, Connecticut poltergeist case that has come up so often in the show. At one point, after we'd been in the house for well over 24 hours, we were sitting at the kitchen table, and in the kitchen were the child and the 2 parents who were the centers of the case, a police officer, Bridgeport, Connecticut police officer, Ed and Lorraine, and me. All of a sudden, Lorraine gave a little yelp, and I watched as the white blister of a second-degree burn appeared on her right hand, which had been on the table in plain sight the whole time. There was no source of heat nearby, and nobody was smoking. And I remember Ed Warren nearly flipped. He wanted Lorraine to leave. And I remember him saying that spontaneous human combustion could take place in a house like this, and he wanted to run. She refused to go, and fortunately never burst into flames, I'm happy to say. Now, we could go on for hours and hours with this oddest of the odd, and it hasn't gotten any less odd as I proceeded with the paranormal investigations over the years. We have to keep, I guess, with our, and we'll move on to some emails here, one particularly that is relevant to our subject tonight, the weirdest of the weird. And to keep up that theme, Ben and I got this email last week from Pam in North Carolina. Dear Paul, I was fascinated by your investigation of the house in Puerto Rico where the family said fairies did their cleaning every week. I can second that because the same thing happened in my grandparents' house when I was a kid, right down to the beer and fruit on Saturday mornings. Now, let me just say that Puerto Rico, 1984, I encountered a family that insisted that these fairies would clean their house every Saturday morning. They'd go for a walk, and they'd leave out fruit and beer, and they'd come back, and the housework would be done. And I set up cameras to take pictures of the fairies, supposedly, and nothing got done. And I'm lucky I didn't end up doing the dishes because they blamed me for the fairies not doing the housework. Anyway, and we go back to our letter from Pam. They came to America from Ireland, this is her grandparents, in 1915, and it seems the fairies came with them. I grew up with stories of their house in Ireland being cleaned by the fairies every week. When they moved to Pennsylvania, the fairies didn't seem to miss a beat. You'll probably think I'm crazy, but once when I was visiting there, I was 5 years old, I went out with my grandparents on the Saturday morning walk, presumably for the fairies to claim. And I happened to look back toward the house, and as God is my witness, I saw a little human face looking at us from around the corner of the house. I never got over that, and I do believe in fairies. Okay. All right, so just, I suppose, to wind up some of our really strange creatures and things that we've encountered here, we've talked about Mothman several times on the show, and we've had our friend Jeff Wamsley on several times to talk about weird creatures who go way beyond what you usually think of as paranormal, Bigfoot and all that sort of thing. And here's one that is one of the strangest I've ever encountered about strange creatures, fairies or not. And this was at about 8:30 p.m. on the evening of the 27th of September, 1954. And my notes here say that 4 French farmers' children were playing in their father's barn high up in the Jura Mountains, and they heard their dog barking. The oldest boy went to investigate and encountered a rectangular creature, which he described as like a lump of sugar. The thing was standing on end and split at the bottom, I guess like 2 legs. The boy threw pebbles and shot a toy arrow at it. He then moved as if to touch the thing. Brave kid, only to be flung to the ground by what he described as an invisible force. He screamed, jumped up, and ran terrified into the yard and saw the being, this, rectangular being, waddling off toward a meadow. The children then ran to the house and on the way saw a glowing red sphere wobbling over the meadow grass 165 yards or so away. The next day, the police discovered a 13-foot circle of flattened grass. Now, we have a lot of these things that seem to be associated with what we would today call UFOs. Certainly in 54, they might have called them UFOs or flying saucers, certainly. And there are case after case after case in America and elsewhere, France, and everywhere else, of UFOs seeming to be associated somehow with these ultra-weird creatures. Now, here's another one. 1954, 9th of October, about 7 p.m., a worker who was on his bicycle at Lavaux near Poitiers in France met a weird 4-foot-tall creature, again, apparently wearing a, what he described as a diver's suit. Okay? Weirder and weirder. And what did Alice say in Alice in Wonderland? Curiouser and curiouser. And what could be seen of its head looked like a mass of hair with big eyes shining through it. This creature shuffled along the road for a minute, then disappeared into the adjacent trees. And it was not Halloween, as you can see from the date. Not surprisingly, this story was the subject of a bunch of jokes in the French media. And what the journalist did not know was that on the October 10th in northeastern France, in the Moselle area, about 6:30 p.m., a shiny machine, quote-unquote, was seen to land by 3 children who were out roller skating. A, quote, kind of man, unquote, just under 4 feet tall, emerged dressed in a black sack, quote-unquote, like a priest's cassock or garb. They later described him as, quote, a ghost, unquote. His face was very hairy and he had big eyes. He held a flashlight that dazzled the children and uttered words they did not understand. Frightened, they beat a hasty retreat and, looking back, saw the machine climbing rapidly into the sky. So it's up to you. All the stuff we've talked about tonight, I don't vouch necessarily for the legitimacy of these things, but people are certainly seeing something, and these things are indeed ultra weird. Again, I've run into them at times myself. I hope that we'll be investigating more. And if you know of such cases, I'd love to hear about them. Thank you, Pam, from North Carolina, for writing in about your fairy experiences. And believe me, nothing is too crazy. Ben and I, or at least I've seen it all, and Ben is starting to see it all. And don't feel that we're going to think you're nuts or wacko, and please do not hesitate to write in your stories or your cases, or certainly to ask questions about anything you've heard tonight. These are, again, the fringe aspects of the paranormal, and boy, it's probably in some ways scary, even more so than some of the rest of the normal paranormal stuff, but it is certainly something that I would never be without. It's just wonderfully stimulating, I think. So anyway, thanks to our producer, Bill Schreiner, and we'll see you next week, January 18th, when Ben and I will welcome Jeremy Robinson. Jeremy is the author of Chronos and several other books. And don't let the fact that he's a novelist fool you. He's an authority on the great New England sea serpent. Okay? seen as recently as 1997. The sightings began in 1641, but the thing must be real older. There must be more than one. So sea monsters, why not? That's at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific next week, right here on Achieve Radio. Watch our website, behindtheparanormal.com, for updates and talking points. And given what we've talked about today, I'll leave you with a kind of a special quote and a challenging thought. Quote, "The entire secret of existence is to have no fear. Never fear what will become of you. Depend on no one. Only then will you be truly free." It's none other than Prince Siddhartha, otherwise known as the Buddha. See you next week.
You're listening to AchieveRadio.com. A new drummer for a new awakening.